Recording.
Awesome, thank you. Well, welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Addam Cinderich. I currently serve as the Director of the Student Support Services Program at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio, but I also have the privilege and honor of serving as your EOA Finance Committee Chair for this year. Today we're going to be talking about the title you can see there, Building a Carry-Forward Budget and What the Heck to Do with All That Money. I'm sure that those of you that are on the call have had carryover in the past. If you haven't, you may this year, given the circumstances in which we find ourselves currently with the virtual switch that many of us had to make and all the funding that we haven't spent on student travel or things like that. Or maybe you have had carryover in the past and you have a larger amount this year. Before we get started, I just want to say a couple of things. This is going to be a somewhat short presentation, and then we are going to open it up for discussion. When I spoke with Madam President Rebecca Stewart, she indicated that it should be very conversational and that we wanted to open it up to get your ideas and experiences. I'll admit I am not a resident expert when it comes to this, but as your finance chair, I said that I would come up and present and help moderate. I am solely presenting from an SSS perspective, but a lot of this is transferable to pre-college programs or McNair. But that's why this is going to be a conversation. So there are many of us on the call. Some of us are college, some of us are pre-college. And so we want to have that time after to share ideas, resources, talk about what we have each done in the past so that we can figure out what we are going to do with all of that money. So that being said, just a friendly reminder, as Kenny said, your microphones have all been muted just to cut down on background noise. But when we get to the end of the slides, you can unmute yourself. So if you haven't located that yet, just kind of look around your screen, find where to click. You are able to unmute yourself when the time comes if you have a question or you would like to share your ideas or experiences. That will definitely help the conversation moving forward. You can also put any questions that you have in the chat function so that you don't forget them until the end, or if you'd like to have them posted there for everyone to read, that would also be helpful. I cannot presently see the chat function as I'm presenting the slides, so I'll ask that maybe Kenny will read them, or when we get to the end of the slides, I can go back and pull up the chat. But either way, feel free to enter questions in the chat for afterwards with thoughts and questions you might have on your mind.
Yep, and I'll for sure help you monitoring the chat box as well.
Thank you, Kenny. So again, if we have anybody joining, my name's Adam. I serve as the Finance Committee Chair for EOA. And let's go ahead and get started. So let me see here if I can get this to work. I've got 3 screens here I'm trying to work. Okay, so what are we going to do? We've got a lot of money. So when the Department of Ed asks if you have a lot of carry forward, but then the second thought is, okay, so now how are you going to spend it? I personally have had a large amount of carryover the last 2 years, and this year is no different. And it happens for a variety of reasons. And it's, a lot of people are sometimes intimidated by carryover. They're not sure how to spend it or if they're going to look upon negatively by the Department of Ed. If you're newer to the TRIO world, it can be somewhat intimidating to see that you have this money left over and, you're worried or concerned that your program specialist is going to wonder, well, what's going on? Why didn't you spend this money? Just know you're not alone. A lot of people have carryover for a variety of reasons, whether it was COVID-19 or you had a staff vacancy and your university or your college requires the search process to play out, which can take months depending on what institution you're at, how the process goes, or even if you have a successful candidate or if you need to reopen the search in the end ultimately. So there are folks on here I can see that I've even taken ideas from because I was trying to figure out some things on how to spend. And so I see some of my colleagues from across the region on the call that, I've reached out to them and said, hey, I have an idea, or can you send me some of the ideas or how you wrote this up? And just know that I'm willing to do that. And I know TRIO, our community, we're always willing to share thoughts and ideas. And that's one of the best things I think about the TRIO realm. So Again, these are just a few thoughts from my perspective. Surely I am not a resident expert. There are folks on this call that have probably been in TRIO many more years than I have, and or had to work on submitting carryover budgets in the past. But I just wanted to take some time to share some of these things to consider. So when you're thinking about how to prepare a carryover budget or how you're going to spend the money, some things you might want to consider are, what year of the grant cycle is it? If you're in, year 5, you're not going to be able to carry over. So you need to figure out ways to spend down now. But if you're in the middle of your grant cycle, or even at the beginning, if you have a staff member depart in year 1 and you find yourself, even after the first year, you're going to have money left over, that can lead to the second item to consider. Should you spread the carryover over multiple remaining years? A lot of professionals don't realize that you can do that. You can request to take a sum of money that you have and spread it over multiple years. One example is, if you know that you have $20,000 and you have 2 years left, then put $10,000 aside for each of the remaining years and spend it on, say, the same thing. Increase a line item that's already in your budget by $10,000 for each of those 2 years. Or add a student cultural immersion experience that you're going to do 2 years in a row. Student travel is often one of the easiest ways to spend large sums of money, I've found personally. But that may not always be the case for you. And given the circumstances with COVID-19, it may not be an option if your institution or your state is not permitting travel. So that's something to consider. Some other things to consider: are there existing line items that you could supplement? So it's already in your budget, but maybe you want to try and take 30 students instead of 20 on this one trip. Or, maybe you had X number of dollars allocated for tutoring or peer mentoring. Maybe you want to increase that to offer additional hours from your tutors and mentors. So think about, are there things that you can supplement? Alternatively, are there items or experiences that you should add? Are there any new things that you could do? This has been something that we've tried to do in my SSS program in the last couple of years, where we've tried to create new experiences for our students with some of the carryover funds. So consider weighing the options of an existing line versus a new item that you could potentially put together for your students. Consider, will certain items benefit a greater number of participants? I know this is something that a lot of program specialists in DC consider when they're reviewing your carryover funds. If you have a large sum of money and you're proposing to do something with all of those, or a large portion of those dollars, and it only benefits 10 of your 140 students, that may not be the best option to submit. I know I personally have an example in a later slide. A couple of years ago, I submitted a carryover budget, and there was only one item that I did not get approved. And that was because going in, I knew that it was a large cost per participant because it did require travel that needed to be done by air. And so, the cost when you add in airfare, that's a per person cost, whereas you can't share or spread that over multiple participants if it is a bus, for example. And so think about the number of participants that you'll be able to offer based on what you consider spending it on. Should you separate out or include your carry forward in your annual budget? I think this is a question I've heard a lot of folks ask, and I think some do it differently. And I think it's okay to do it either way. You may talk to someone at COE who maybe can give you certain advice. I'm not going to speak on behalf of COE. You may also have a program specialist who prefers that it be submitted a certain way. And so if you submit it and they ask you to revise it, I wouldn't necessarily be surprised, because they may say, well, you included it in your year 4 line item budget, for example, but I'd like to see it separate, with a separate budget or a separate narrative, to see separate from your actual annual budget what's left and how you plan on spending it. And so I have some examples that I'll show you how I've done that in the past. And then what's the deal with spending it on technology? We often see a lot of questions swirling about, can I spend money on technology? I'm going to be under the $5,000 threshold. What type of technology can I purchase? And that's going to depend on program. I've heard, especially this year, given the circumstances, I've heard of pre-college programs purchasing equipment for students. so that they're able to participate in their virtual summer program for Upward Bound, for example. And I don't know that something like that would necessarily fly for SSS. For us, you know, all of our technology needs to remain in a centralized office so that all of our students can benefit from the purchase of that equipment. So things like tablets, for example. And we'll go into that a little more in a second. So again, consider the future impacts. Do you have to spend it all because you're in the last year of your grant cycle? Do you have a need to, or do you have enough that you could spread it over multiple years? And can you sustain any changes that may come as a result of the new plan? So if you're going to allocate money for multiple years for the same thing, make sure or try to be, keep in mind, you know, is this something that is sustainable? Will you be permitted to do this each year? The other item, so for example, grant aid. With student support services programs, and this has come up, I think if you've heard the chatter in the TRIO community, many people are learning, or it's being reiterated for their recollection, that with SSS grants, we are able to provide grant aid if it was written into our original grant proposal. The question, because this is year 5, the question previously in years 1 through 4 was, if I have carryover, can I increase my grant aid line? And your program specialist can approve that, and yes, you can, providing you are adhering to the matching and the 20% of your federal dollar regulations in 646.33. However, you may not be able to sustain that amount of grant aid in each of the remaining years of your grant cycle. And so if I want to increase my grant aid line by $10,000 in year 3, if I don't have enough to sustain that and add an additional $10,000 to year 4 and 5, then I can't do that, because once I increase it, it needs to remain at that level for the duration of the grant cycle. So here's an example of supplementing a previously approved item in your budget. So this is actually something taken directly from one of my submissions to my program specialist. The upper left box, you can see the category is the annual leadership retreat. So we're from the great state, the great cloudy state of Ohio. I'm going to apologize if you hear some rumbles of thunder. It is currently storming, so hopefully I don't lose connection or power during this webinar. But we have our annual leadership retreat each year, which is at Camp Muskingum. It's an Ohio FFA camp on a lake. We take our students for overnight travel. We do leadership development and self-reflection activities with them to help them identify their leadership style, their leadership traits. And so it's a really great experience. And so the first box where it says $4,000 shows you the students and staff, what the estimate breakdown is, how much it costs per participant or per person when you include the staff, and then a short description of what is going to take place. And this is how I typically submit all of my carryover items, so that it's broken down and shows the amount. I also submit a student travel narrative with my line item budget each year. So while my line item budget may say $12,500 for student travel, I then submit a supplemental document in Word that just has, for example, 3 of the little boxes that you see on your screen now, to show what travel and how the $12,500 is going to be spent. That way, when they're reviewing my budget, my program specialist doesn't look at it and go, are you spending $12,500 on one trip with 10 students, or are you spreading it out over multiple trips with several batches of students? And so the first one is what was in my original line item budget for the year. So that's what that looks like. The second box where it says annual leadership retreat supplement is I wanted to increase both the number of students that I take as well as the number of activities that we participate in. So I was increasing the number of students from 17 to 30 total students. And I was also adding some additional activities, and which resulted in adding an additional night overall. And so given the original approved line and the supplement that was approved, I now have $7,000 to spend on that trip. And so this is how I generally submit. So that was for a previously approved item that was already in my budget. Here is an example of creating a new student experience. This was something that unfortunately was not approved a couple of years ago. And it was an alternative spring break experience to Puerto Rico. This was shortly after Hurricane Maria tragically devastated Puerto Rico. And our university offers service learning experiences over spring break. And we do an alternative spring break or a service learning trip over spring break each year. But this year, or this particular year, we wanted to try and increase the funding to be able to take them to Puerto Rico and volunteer during the cleanup and assist in Puerto Rico after Maria had hit the island. Unfortunately, this was denied. And you can see here the total amount was $12,760, so it was a decent amount of money. And you can see the breakdown where the cost per participant was high. And again, of that $887, almost half went towards airfare and luggage for the students. So right off the bat, the cost per participant for just airfare exceeded what I may spend on the entire trip for other things or other locations that I've taken students in the past. So this is just one example that was denied because of how high the cost per participant was. Now, again, this can be program specialist specific. You may have a program specialist who's a little bit more lenient or has different thresholds in their mind about what is an acceptable cost per participant. But for me, this particular one was too high. However, a different new experience that we created that I was able to get approved was a Cedar Point career seminar. For those of you not from the state of Ohio or nearby in Michigan or Indiana, if you're not familiar, Cedar Point is the roller coaster capital of the world. And it is a giant amusement park in Sandusky, only about an hour and 20 minutes from my institution. So we were looking at fun ways that we can engage our students. And one thing that we came up with was a career seminar, an internship seminar, where if you look in the narrative, some of the white highlighted text will give you some key phrases that I used to appeal to my program specialist. So our seminar included a presentation by the Cedar Point leadership team, highlighting their internships and industry clusters that comprise their workforce, how they align to different degree programs at Kent State University, and then also the special programs and benefits available to interns, because many of the interns at Cedar Point, they're seasonal in the summer, and they actually are college students from around the world. It says that program participants were given an exclusive behind-the-scenes tour of several divisions and departments where they had firsthand look at the operations, and they met additional staff, including senior leadership members. They participated in a career-focused scavenger hunt on day 2. So they got to go into the park, take advantage of the park amenities, ride the rides, but they were still asked to complete a career-themed scavenger hunt. Asking them to speak to an intern while they're there. Find an intern, ask them what's their major and how has their experience at Cedar Point been. And then after returning from the trip, we did ask them to submit a 1 to 2 page reflective essay where we asked them to describe what they had learned from the experience, identify and discuss 3 potential opportunities they learned about that align with their major or their career interests, and then discuss how the experience helped them think about post-graduation plans in a unique way. And so there was a lot of content here, and you'll notice that the cost per participant outlined was around $475, about half of what had been proposed for the Puerto Rico service learning experience. So this was approved. This is probably one of the most fun experiences we were able to provide for our students. We did end up having additional carryover this last year and had gotten approval to do this again. However, because of COVID-19, we unfortunately had to cancel the trip. We would have been leaving in about a week to take our students this year. But student travel can't happen, and Cedar Point, unfortunately, is still not open for the season yet. So what's the deal with technology? Again, there's a lot of conversation that typically happens, and I'm not a resident expert when it comes to all TRIO programs. I just know some of the conversations that I've had with fellow colleagues. And to be honest, getting approval for technologies such as computers, it can be tricky. I know a lot of people, when they start winding down their 5-year grant cycle and they're recognizing, okay, I may have some money left and I can't carry it over because our grant cycle is ending. Can I buy some computers for my computer lab? And while you may need those technological updates because you have dinosaur computers running in your computer labs, you know, there may be good cause for the program specialist to question, well, you know, this is the end of your grant cycle. And so they worry that, you know, if you're not refunded, then you essentially have purchased a lot of technology that essentially becomes property of the university and is not necessarily benefiting TRIO participants. And so there can be some skepticism, but I have heard many, many success stories of folks getting technology approved. So some things to consider are, excuse me, discuss how many students the technology will assist. For me, I've written in the past for computers, and I am a program of 300 SSS participants every year. And I went back and looked at what's an average number over the last couple of years. What's our average number of students that utilize tutoring in a given year? And it turned out it was on average between 150 to 175 of our students in a given academic year utilized it. So if our sessions are taking place in our computer labs, I can honestly say with data to my program specialist that revamping or updating these computers in our labs will benefit all participants, and that we typically have between 150 to 175 participants that utilize the computers on a regular basis for tutoring, which is a required service. And so that was something that I think helped boost that ask. Include or reiterate a checkout process. So if you are, depending on your grant and the needs of the technology, again, you know, I've heard of upward bound programs, especially in the current times, purchasing individual technology so that their participants can be active and engaged in their summer program remotely. But under normal circumstances, such as, you know, 2-3 years ago, you know, you may not be able to hand out individual technology to a student. For SSS, for example, at my institution, you know, I reiterate that we're going to have a checkout process and that all of the technology will be kept in our office with a sign-out sheet. And that way it's available to any of the 300 students that walk in the door at any given time. If I'm loaning it out to one student, that student could potentially monopolize that laptop, and while they may need it, I may have other students that also need it. So it allows them to see that we're going to try and benefit as many students as possible. Also think about other options. It doesn't have to be a computer. Consider other items such as tablets that may be less expensive but have the functionality that you need for whatever the purpose is. Graphing calculators. This is something that year after year I have submitted because I slowly was trying to build up a good number of graphing calculators so that all of my tutors and the students, you know, if I have 6 or 7 appointments going on at one time, there aren't only 2 or 3 graphing calculators to be used, now that the majority of courses offered at our institution require a graphing calculator. Also think about new or upgraded software. So one example for our program, you may use Bloomin or some other software. We personally use Student Access from Heiberg. We recently switched at the beginning of this year from the desktop version to the online platform. There's a one-time setup fee, and there is an increase in the cost each year for the support and the housing of your data on their servers. So we planned out to build that in, and that is probably one of the best decisions we ever made, because now that we are fully virtual, I can't imagine how I would have accessed our database from home given how the process worked before. And now it's all cloud-based. So that was a wonderful decision that if you haven't done it, maybe explore, because it's much easier to use the virtual platform, at least for student access. However, I have heard colleagues say that Bloomin is very similar. So when preparing your carryover budget, this is going to be a personal preference. So you do what you are comfortable with, what you think your program specialist would like or has asked for. But this is just an example of the carryover budget as I submit it. So what I do is I draft it, and here are some of the examples. This is a screenshot of the first page. So what I do is I, you know, the first bullets there, provide an overview and include. So a couple of the items I include at the top are the total carry forward amount and also a summary of why the funds are remaining. So in this example, the total carryover entering year 5 was estimated to be around $73,000. And it was due to staff vacancies that resulted in unspent salary and benefit dollars. And so with multiple searches ongoing, we quickly accumulated unspent funds. So I just kind of summarized that at the top. That way they're not wondering, all right, what's going on? Why are you not spending down as you should? Then I go into the individual lines that I'm proposing. So for me, I'm all about the details. I think that is actually also one of my downfalls, because if I give too much, that could raise some flags. A lot of people, when they give advice on contacting your program officer, you may hear, only give them as much as they need. And that is true in many cases. But I found with a carryover budget, you're asking to spend money that they don't have to allow you necessarily on certain things, and you may want to request it for a variety of items. So you really want that approval, right? And so I just provide them as much as I possibly can without going so specific. For example, lodging. I don't say where we're going to stay or how much the cost is per night, but I do break it down to give them, here's how much of this line I'm going to spend on lodging for this trip in total. So the second set here, you can see, be as detailed as possible and include things like the total amount for each line, estimated breakdown of those expenses. What is your cost per person or per participant? This, I think, helps them kind of conceptualize how much you're going to be spending and what the cost is per person. As I said, with Puerto Rico, I was denied because it was over $800. But for these items, we're looking at amounts that are less than that. And then a short narrative describing the experience. So what are you going to do? As best as you can, tie in your required and permissible services. Use those buzzwords that are going to stand out in your narrative. So if it's a required service, definitely highlight that. For us, anytime we do an alternative spring break trip for an immersive service learning experience with our students, we always tie in a graduate school visit to a nearby university on either the first or the last day of the trip. That way, we're adding an additional service provided during the same trip with very, very little additional cost, if any, because we already would have been paying for the meals for that day. And most universities, all of the presentations, the tours, and all of those items, there's no cost for those. But it adds another service that we can say we're providing to our participants all in that one trip. So that's something that we do. In this example, you can see I was proposing a graduate school trip. We were taking some students to the state of Michigan. And this, again, was a supplement because this was one of the original 3 trips that I had built into my budget at the beginning of the year and was given approval. However, I was seeking an additional $3,000 so that I could increase the number of students. And with that came changing to a bus as opposed to individual van rentals from Enterprise. And so I wanted the supplement. The other item being the leadership retreat supplement, which I shared earlier on a previous slide. And then I also was requesting CPR first aid training certification for all of my staff and graduate assistants because we do travel with students frequently. In my program, I thought it would be good to have all of us certified. I will say I didn't know exactly how much it was going to cost for this, if it was going to be through our campus partner on campus who is certified to train, or if we were going to have to go with a third-party vendor to do this. But I did include that as well. One thing I didn't put in the bullets here that I'll mention is I also include the indirects. So if you know that one of the items that you are proposing is going to require indirects, I always include that in there. So for example, the third option, the CPR and first aid training, because that is for staff, I budgeted $2,000, but then that $160 is because I've included indirects on that. For us, we also break down our indirects. So if a particular line is going to have indirects, but only on the staff portion, for example, we break that down as well. So this is just an example of how mine looks. Again, you can submit yours. This is just an example. I believe I got the idea and the format for this from a colleague in the state of Indiana who's on the call. She had sent me some of hers and I kind of modified and tweaked it. And so let's not reinvent the wheel. If you like any of this that you see, I'm certainly happy to send you the template and share. So feel free to reach out after this webinar. All right, so I would love to hear some of your thoughts, your experiences, your ideas. So I'm going to ask Kenny if there are any questions in the chat feature, and I'm going to try and turn on the chat myself. But also, if there is anyone that would like to share any thoughts or feedback, if you have any ideas or things that you've done in the past that you think would be a great idea to consider. You know, I mentioned technology, student travel. These are a lot of the big, big items that allow you to spend a lot of money very quickly. And so I know that tends to be what we focus on, but there can also be a lot of little things that add up. And so I would love to turn it over and hear any of your thoughts and ideas. So remember that you are all on mute. If you would like to unmute and ask a question, or I believe there is a raise hand function. Kenny, I'm not sure if you want to moderate that for me.
Yes, I'll be here. And you only have one question so far. Has any UB programs had any response from the Department of Ed about meeting the participant numbers this year?
Yeah, so anybody feel free to chime in. I know, again, I'm not SSS, but I share in the frustration because I am pretty sure I've not heard anything publicly or on any listserv or even official communication from the Department of Ed. For those who attended policy seminar, you may have heard the department say that they were going to provide an FAQ page in a couple of weeks. We're now beyond a couple of months. So I share in that frustration, but I will open it up if there are any UB staff on the call that would like to answer or share.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the question very well. Could you repeat it one more time?
Sure. Has any UB programs had any response from the Department of Ed about meeting the participant numbers this year? So your funded to serve number, have you received any feedback from the Department of Ed about meeting that number?
I haven't received any feedback directly from the Department of Ed, but in another webinar that I was in, it was a COA webinar, they had mentioned that they have a verbal agreement to use your significant progress from the prior year. So for example, if you met your numbers the prior year, supposedly we are able to use that data for this year. Now, I don't have any official confirmation of that, but has anyone else heard about that?
Anybody else like to respond? Anyone?
Hi, this is Nayshawn, everybody. I think the response or lack thereof is indicative of what we've been getting from DOE. So I don't think that anyone has given us any solid information. I also heard similar information by COE as well, but the fact that we've entered a new budget year for many of us as of June 1 and have yet to hear anything is very disheartening. At this point, you know, I think we can only go with what our regs say. You know, our legs and our regs say, and take the guidance of COE and go from there. At this point, we can't be blamed for not receiving information or doing things that may go against what the department had hoped we done. And had they provided us with FAQs or some more guidance, then they could have more to say. But at this point, I say we move forward, stumble forward, do what you need to do and apologize if you have to.
Yeah, I would say those are the sentiments that a lot of folks are echoing is, you know, just don't ask for and wait for the approval, just do it and then apologize later, because they have been very silent during all of this, unfortunately. All right, what other questions might we have? Kenny?
I'm not looking through. I don't think I see any new ones.
I see there. Oh, okay. There is one here. I see above that. Will the PowerPoint be shared? Yes, we are recording this and I can share this as well as the recording of the presentation with everybody. Looks like someone did send me directly a question in case anybody else is wondering. So it was, what is the what is my funded enrollment number? So my SSS program, we are funded to serve 300 participants per year. What other questions? Anybody not have a question in the chat that they'd like to ask? Feel free to unmute and ask, or if you have an idea, share with everybody.
Hey, Adam, this is Stacy Malakara from Wisconsin.
Hi.
And hi. So I know you said that if we have any suggestions for how to spend money, big or small, to share. So because it's Pride Month and because we're not able to take our students out to any kind of cultural events, we're trying to put together a virtual drag show on Zoom. So we're going to be reaching out to some local performers and making contracts with them to do a show on Zoom and maybe like a talk back. So we're really excited about that. That'll happen later this month.
Awesome. Really creative idea. That's awesome. I've heard similar ideas from colleagues who were trying to put together campus visits, whether that be 2-year SSS programs, UB in the summer, trying to, do their college campus visits, trying to do all of those virtually. I'm not certain as to how much of an expense those would be, because a lot of institutions have provided campus tours and presentations at no cost, but that is a great example of, you could intertwine with the cultural immersion experience, or replace it if it was in person previously. See if there are any other questions that have been in the chat yet, Kenny?
Nothing new.
I see a couple of other comments that someone added Bloomin' Online just before COVID hit, and it has really been helpful while telecommuting. I could not agree more. I'm so glad that we switched to student access online at the beginning of the year. It's something we had talked about for a year or more, but finally decided to go through and get it up and running before the end of this cycle. Let's see. Let's say there's a question here. I'm an SSS program in year 5 with about 15,000 remaining to spend down. We originally allotted that amount for our approved cultural trip, which we couldn't take due to COVID-19. Do any fellow SSS programs have any ideas to share? So we heard one. Does anybody else have any ideas on items to share about summer programming or how to spend down some funds, especially those SSS programs who, at this point, we have gotten zero guidance on whether or not we're going to be able to carry it over into year 1 of the next cycle if we're refunded. So I think at this point, a lot of us should probably start to plan on how we're going to spend it down now. So to your question, what other program ideas do you have? Anybody have any thoughts?
I was just going to mention, hi, my name is Lindsay Donovan. I work for an SSS program at Neosho County Community College in a very small southeast Kansas town. Our program, all of the money that we had set aside for all the student trips that got canceled, we fortunately did have grant aid written into our grant, and so we blew out grant aid this year. We moved all of that money over. Almost every single student that had applied for it through us ended up being able to get it. Normally we only give out about 10 awards a semester, but we were able to give it out to, I think, over 35 students just this semester alone. And so I know that really helped a lot of the students and kind of made up for the fact that things were so scary and a lot of them were having to buy equipment and not being able to go on the trips. And then some of our other funds, we've really tried to put a focus on improving our services and doing things that hopefully will help our program grow in the future. We've been doing, right now we're looking into Bridges Out of Poverty training for the employees, different things like that. We're also looking at we are looking at replacing some of our equipment, and we've got COVID-19 in mind. So like, whereas before we were looking at replacing some of our desktop computers, we're now looking at laptops or equipment that can go home with the employees so we can work virtually if needed. So we're going through all of our services with a fine-tooth comb, trying to think how can we take this online at a moment's notice if we need to. So
Yeah, great
Adam,
ideas. Hi, Nick.
Adam, this is Nick Sullivan at University of Northern Iowa SSS program. And just one thing I'd point out, in us spending down our funds, you know, you want to use everything you can use to support our students. However, you are not going to be penalized if at the end of this fiscal year, at the end of a 5-year cycle, money goes back. It's not a panic situation. And our grants and contracts office is at the point right now, they're not allowing me to spend much money on things because you can't stockpile things for a year that's coming up that you don't know yet if it's going to be funded. Now, after July, early July, if we get notification that we have been refunded, I'm going to start spending stuff because the school year starts before our fiscal year ends. So since our school year starts on August 21st or whatever, we have a strategies for academic success class. We'll be buying things, flash drives and things for those students, other supplies that I can justify and say, the school year's starting and we need these things to start the year. But I'm not overly panicked that I have money left right now that I'm having a hard time figuring out how to spend.
Yeah, no, those are great points. Yeah, you're not going to be penalized or, you know, viewed negatively in any way if you don't spend all the funding. You know, given the circumstances, and it is the end of the cycle. So yeah, if you do end up having money that goes back, you're not going to be penalized. You just miss out on the opportunity to be able to spend it. But in some instances, it may be too much to figure out how to spend, right? And so that's a really great point. I appreciate that, Nick. The other point Nick mentioned too was, yeah, you know, for me, about a month ago, my team and I, we put together and brainstormed some contingency plans for a couple of different options. So what happens if we're able to carry over the money? What would we do with the money? And a lot of it was essentially just kicking our previous student travel a year out. And so if it was a trip in April, we do it next April. We plan for a middle option where, you know, we're going to have the funds to carry over and we're not allowed to do student travel. We did another option where we aren't allowed to carry over the funds, but we, for some reason, are able to do some type of workshops or travel face-to-face before August 31st. So those were our two middle options we had thrown around ideas for. And then the last one is, you know, if we can't carry over the money and we can't do student travel, which unfortunately is seeming to be the more realistic option, how might we do that? And, you know, part of that conversation, similar to the comment that was shared, was, okay, let's move some money into grant aid. You know, for those who are looking for the regulation, I think I mentioned 646.33 talks about grant aid and the requirements for that. So the first one being that you cannot spend more than 20% of your federal award on grant aid. So calculate what that dollar amount is. And then the other regulation is about the matching requirement. I don't want to misspeak, but I'm going to say, and if someone else would like to jump on, I believe the matching requirement has been waived by the Department of Ed. So as long as you are not spending greater than 20% of your federal dollars, you can exceed the matching. That is my current understanding. And again, I don't know definitively. Does anybody want to chime in and confirm or offer their interpretation of the current circumstances? Remember, you're muted, so if someone is trying to chime in, just make sure you unmute yourself.
That's my understanding as well.
Great, thank you.
Me too.
Awesome, thank you, Nick and Jennifer. All right, Kenny, any other comments, even if they're not questions? Are there any examples or anything that anybody has shared in the chat that might be worthy for others to hear?
Yeah, we had a few comments. Scrolling back, sorry.
Perfect.
I'm planning to purchase the Innovative Educators product, Go to Orientation. Even though we plan to have face-to-face institutions instruction at my institution, other gatherings will need to be virtual. It seemed like a great product, but also allows me to essentially purchase ahead for the next year because I need to be available before a new budget year starts. So, and then a couple of people talking about paradigm shifts for some of their conferences, campus tours. And that's about it so far.
Sorry, are you still there, Kenny?
Yep. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sorry, it cut out just a little bit on that last part. So I just want to make sure you weren't still talking and it was cutting out.
No, and then someone was saying they use paradigm shift for some of their events as well.
Yep. Okay. Yep. I've heard similar student lingo and paradigm shift, other vendors that have been used by programs. And I think that's a great point, and it also speaks to what Nick was talking about too. Is, you know, are there things that you can spend your funding on that would be available to your students effective immediately, so you can share it out to your existing participants? But if it's a year subscription or something like that, it allows you to also have that available for next year because we're already in June. And so, you know, are there things that you can spend the money on that you can justify because you're going to provide it as a resource or a service to your students now, but would allow you to continue having the access to it for next year for any new participants or any other participants that don't utilize it this year between now and August 31st. So those are good points that also address what Nick was saying about, you know, you can't go and buy supplies for a trip that you wrote in year one in the next proposal, you know, buy that with this year's money. So that's a good suggestion. Other things in the chat at all, Kenny? I'm trying to scroll through myself here as I. The thunder. That was thunder. If you heard that noise.
Someone asked if anyone use readyeducation.com, which integrates Canvas, Blackboard, Zoom, etc. To communicate with students, send calendars, reminder. Was one of the questions. Someone suggested using virtualjobshadow.com. And that's it so far.
Anybody want to take any of those from the pre-college perspective? What was it again? Anyone know of any other companies to pay to do virtual things that you would recommend for pre-college programs? Anybody have any recommendations? Just make sure to unmute. There's a comment here that says the University of Iowa Upward Bound is using the defamation project this summer, and that cost is at $3,500. I'm not sure what all that entails, but just wanted to mention that. I think there was also, we talked about focus training and paradigm shift. I'm not sure if they have resources or tools separated by pre-college or college. Someone mentioned Bridges Out of Poverty and emotional poverty training and said that those were excellent. Let's see. The link for the defamation experience was provided in the chat. Thank you. Anybody else have any thoughts for pre-college programs about virtual resources? There's a comment here. We're working with a company called Major Decision to purchase video chats for our UB students to talk to current college students. Nice. Share their experience.
Yeah, that was my comment. We haven't actually worked with them yet, but they've been really easy to work with so far. They are cutting us a discount on their normal prices, and we go through their platform so that we're not exchanging private data between anybody. And they also asked us, like, students can search based on which college they want to go to, if they're looking for someone who is a specific major, if they identify with a particular group, like race, LGBTQ, whatever they're looking for, so they can match somebody who has like a similar background if that's something that they're concerned about too. So like I said, I can't vouch for it because we haven't used their services yet, but they've been really good to work with during the planning process.
Awesome, thank you for sharing that. See, I'm just scrolling through the chat here. There's a question, do any of the college programs use the readyeducation.com app, which integrates with Canvas, Blackboard, Zoom, etc., to communicate with students, send calendar reminders, etc.? I can tell you from my personal experience, we have never used that. We do have Blackboard at our institution as our learning management system. We use Blackboard Ultra, or Blackboard Collaborate Ultra is how we managed our peer tutoring appointments when we had to transition over to virtual in March. So we set up all of our tutoring appointments. We did our late night study events with drop-in tutors available through Blackboard Collaborate Ultra. So that was a very useful tool. As far as communicating with students, if you don't have student access online and you are thinking about transitioning, one of the benefits to student access online is that your grant is assigned a telephone number and you are able to text your students directly from within the virtual platform, and the student can actually respond and it will pop up with a note in student access on your screen to tell you that you have 1 or 3 or 5 unread messages. And so you can text back and forth. It comes from that phone number. And any member of your team can text the student. So as long as you have access and the permissions to be able to get into that part of student access, you can respond. So that's how we've communicated with our students recently with texting. But does anybody else have any experience with the readyeducation.com app? All right, I'm not hearing any. Again, if you are trying to speak, please make sure you unmute first. Let's see, anything else in the chat here, Kenny, that I might be missing? I'm trying to scroll through. Someone mentioned to be sure to consider Grammarly if you haven't already done that. Someone said we're thinking about using AHA process for professional development for motivation and also boys in crisis. We are the ones that use them already this summer for the emotional poverty and also the main poverty training. University of Iowa Upward Bound is using uvisit.com for virtual college tours, job shadowing. I agree. Stephanie says, probably goes without saying, but I would agree with this. If you don't already use an online tutoring program, now would be a great time to check into some of the ones that are available. She said that they've used tutorme.com and they've enjoyed using that service. We at Kent State University, like I said, we do an internal tutoring program. We use Blackboard Collaborate Ultra for the sessions, but we also utilize TutorTrack. It's through Red Rock. TutorTrack allows us to do all of our scheduling and our tracking of attendance in the system, and then it also allows us to generate reports for different time periods to see how many students utilize it. You can sort the students by their individual student ID number or their name to see how many appointments they've had. You can sort by subject to see what subjects you might have the most or least tutoring for. So if you're looking at who do I need to hire for tutoring for next year, you'll see what your demand is for various subjects. So that's another example. Another person said that they just signed with TutorMe. There is a question here about how does TutorMe billing work? So I don't know if anybody wants to unmute and speak to how the billing works, or if somebody, Kim, if you want to specify, are there any specific questions about billing? Are you wondering is it quarterly, or is it a flat rate or per session? What specifically are you asking?
This is Stephanie from Simpson. I tried to answer that question, but then it kind of got lost in all of the other chats. So I sent it directly to Kim, but just for everyone else, our previous director actually purchased our hours. So I haven't been part of the billing process, but I know that she purchased 300 hours and those hours never expire, which is super nice, and ultimately why that has been good for us as we've been working on getting our students used to using that product. So that's about all I can say, though.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie, for explaining that.
Mm-hmm.
Someone here mentions we are also starting the Band app. Seems like a great tool for communication. It would describe a mix between Remind and Facebook, but much more secure than Facebook. Another person says, we have tutoring for all of our high school students through photo study. And I now see Stephanie's response about the hours never expiring. Another person says student access is awesome. They moved over last fall. Another says they like photo study as they bill per student per month. It's easy to budget and not worry about it later. There's another question. I apologize for missing this earlier, but it says, we are a nonprofit with EOC, talent search, and Upward Bound. We include the indirect cost in our administrative budget. We are trying very hard to spend as much money before the close of the fiscal year as to not greatly affect our administrative budget. How are other nonprofits handling this? Are there any others from nonprofits that might have an experience to share, or talk about a little bit about how you're handling this if you're experiencing something similar or trying to navigate this? Anybody? All right, so I'm not hearing anybody, but this would be a great question. If you're not already in conversations with COE, I would definitely submit the question there, whether it be to Angelica from Professional Development or Lucy Jones or anybody at COE. They can definitely forward it to the correct person, but they definitely would probably be able to provide some insight. You may also, if you're not familiar with the listserv, post it to the TRIO listserv and see if you get any responses there. I've had pretty good luck and seen a lot of others get great feedback and response rates from posting it there. Another person said we're on our 3rd year of student access online. It had been mentioned in a webinar earlier today with the higher education program. Thank you for the info about student access online. Here's a question. Do you know if there is a deadline for submitting carryover budget for fiscal year that started June 1st? I'm personally not aware of the deadlines. Our fiscal year for SSS is September 1. I've had different deadlines for my budget. What I typically tend to try and do is submit my carryover at the same time that I submit my individual year line item budget, so that I can just get approval all at once. I know that may not always be a possibility depending on when the request from your program specialist, the deadline they provide, or how your institution works at reconciling any last expenses, and if you're still trying to calculate how much carryover you may actually have. But does anybody who has a June 1 start for their fiscal year, have you heard anything at all? Any Upward Bound staff?
No, we have not. We have a start date of June 1st. We did not receive anything related to budget submission or carryover on when we received the GAN last week.
Okay. Thank you for that. Let's see. What other questions might we have? It's like the University of Iowa Upward Bound is looking into Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, and the link is there. If anybody's interested in checking that out, I'm not sure what type of service or resource that is, but the link is provided in the chat, so you're welcome to check that out online. For college programs, AHA process also has the College Achievement Alliance, training, understanding, and engaging the under-resourced college student. There is another Upward Bound. I have not heard anything from the department and have not yet received the GAN. So it seems like they're similar to how it was for other programs in other years, going out in maybe some different waves. But it does seem like a consistent theme among the Upward Bound programs that have June 1 starts is that they have not received communication regarding budget submission for approval or carry forward requests. Any other questions, or I know we just went through and kind of intermixed some questions and ideas, but does anybody else have any ideas of how you're planning on spending down the carryover funding that you might have that others might be interested in hearing? Again, just be sure to unmute yourself if you'd like to share. I do know a colleague from the state of Ohio had indicated that she was looking at potentially doing a modified face-to-face bridge for her SSS program. So kind of a transition back to the fall semester that would take place during the current fiscal year. And, you know, I know Nick had mentioned earlier about, you know, is it for the next academic year or not? But this, because it does fall prior to the start of the fall semester, and if you do it for existing participants who are already in your program, it would basically be at the end of, you know, an existing fiscal year. And so, you know, whether that be like a modified face-to-face, modified residential program, or you're going to invite guest speakers, things of that nature, you know, that could be one way that if student travel is still prohibited at your institution, you know, you may be able to do something on campus just in a modified delivery format. But because they would be on campus and you're eliminating the travel piece, that might be something that your institution allows, that you could spend some funds.
One other thing we're doing, Adam, this Nick, University of Northern Iowa, SSS program, our two advisors who are both relatively new in the last 3 years will be going through the appreciative advising training. Appreciative advising is offering 2-day, 4-hour per day training on the elements of appreciative advising. One session is in June and another in July, 1 2-day session in June, another in July. And then they also are less applicable in this discussion, but a longer 8-week-long course during the fall semester.
Yeah.
And appreciative advising is a style of holistic advising, how to get to know your students and provide holistic advising to them once they're in your program.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. Thank you. And then actually thinking about the broader conversation surrounding professional development opportunities, you know, if staff, you know, thinking about SSS or even staff who are working remotely through their summer programs with pre-college students, if the opportunity exists that you can participate in any type of professional development, you know, now's a good time to be able to do that from the comfort of your own home. You know, whether it be a lot of the priority trainings that I've seen move to a virtual format. If you haven't done any of the priority trainings, I would encourage you to take a look and see which ones might still be available, which ones may be of interest to you. And, you know, you may be able to participate in some of those. I will caution and say that depending on the cost structure of the grantee that is performing the training, there may not be a registration cost. So you may, the cost that you may have incurred may have been the actual travel itself. So there may not be a cost, you know, that you're able to spend down, but it's a good opportunity and a good reminder to do something similar. Speaking just more broadly about professional development, you know, that's another good way to spend down some of your carryover with things like if you were able to do priority trainings in the future. One thing that we had planned for one of our SSS coordinators at Kent State University, who oversees our tutoring program, was to do the summer program with the CRLA, the College Reading and Learning Association, who certifies TRIO programs based on the rigor of their training for tutors and their ongoing professional development for their tutors. Our program is level 1 certified by CRLA, and each summer, typically in the month of July, they offer a summer program. It's a professional development experience, so their Summer Institute, and it essentially is a lot of information, training materials. You receive a binder of a whole bunch of different topics to cover during your tutor training and your ongoing professional development with them. And so that was something that we had originally intended for her to attend because it was great professional development experience and would benefit not just the individual staff, but also our tutors and then therefore our students. So that was one thing that we had talked about in our program as well. I see a couple of other things coming in the chat here. Let's see. Has anyone used JST, maybe more for coaching professional development? So I don't know if anybody, again, if you're gonna, make sure you just unmute yourself if you're gonna respond. There was a comment here, a great resource for financial literacy is igrad.com. There is a question here. I have 2 new staff starting who would really benefit from trainings, but we have used our professional development budget for the year on previous staff. Since SSS has a cap on the amount that can be spent on professional development, as far as I understand it, I assume I need to ask permission to exceed that. Any advice? And am I misunderstanding anything? So that's a great question. I think there can sometimes be a little confusion. And for those who are non-SSS, this may not be something that you're familiar with, but SSS does have a cap on the amount of funding each year we are permitted to spend on travel. So what I would say is that you phrase it as though as spending it on professional development. The way that I interpret and the way that we operate is that it's on travel, not necessarily the professional development as a whole. And what I mean by that is if you are registering for a webinar or something of that nature, or you're paying the registration fee for a training or something like that, that is actually not something that is considered travel. And so when we calculate our 4%, we break down the expenses into travel and non-travel. So things like airfare, luggage, any transportation or parking at the airport, your per diems and your hotel lodging, those are all things that count towards that 4%. My understanding is that the actual registration itself does not count towards the 4% because that you can do professional development, you know, from the comfort of your own home through webinars, right? And so my understanding is that it's 4% on travel, and travel being the actual other items that I mentioned, not the cost of registration or participating in a webinar or something like that. So if you haven't done this, I would recommend maybe go back and look and see how you've calculated your 4%, and it may actually free up some money that you had put into that bucket of professional development and free that up for those new staff. However, you can request to exceed that 4%. And one of the best and most effective justifications in doing that is to say you've hired additional staff and they would greatly benefit from professional development opportunities, and that you're seeking to exceed the 4% in order to provide that to those staff members. So I would recommend that you can ask for that approval. And I think that if any reason is going to work best, I would think that that would resonate really well because they're new staff and you want to provide that opportunity with them. And so that seems to be reasonable when you ask to exceed. Yep. Someone says 4% of travel. I have webinars in a completely separate section of our budget. Yes. So seems like what Nick is saying is similar to what I mentioned about travel being the actual act of traveling. So not necessarily all of the costs associated with conference attending or, you know, professional development opportunities. And it looks like Nick just gave me a thumbs up. So good to know. But yes, you're not alone in that for sure. There are a lot of people who interpret that to mean any type of professional development, you know, a conference, for example. If you pay $350 for the registration fee at a conference, you know, that can take a huge portion of your 4%. But if you remove that, you know, and you're only paying for the flight and per diems, you know, you definitely can free up some additional money. Yep. And I think to the point that was just made in the chat, yeah, I think a lot of us are always very cautious and conservative in our interpretations of things, because we never want to be caught in a position where, you know, they're saying that you're not adhering to the legs and regs. But it is good to know, you know, when others are able to offer their interpretation and to hear what others are doing, to know that, okay, I'm not alone in this, and, you know, this seems reasonable, which is, I think, you know, reasonable and applicable is what they say. Any other questions or comments or good ideas that people want to share on how to spend carryover? We're at almost about 4:15, so we do have 15 minutes left. Should anybody else want to share, we definitely can take your questions or hear ideas from you. All right, well, hearing none and not seeing anything new in the chat, I guess I'll just close by saying thank you to everybody for jumping on this idea sharing webinar. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, I am not necessarily a resident expert. There are people who were probably on the call that have done carryover budgets for many more years than I have, but I at least wanted to get the conversation started. I hope you found the slides and the ideas and how to organize your budgets or your narratives helpful. As I mentioned, this is being recorded and will be shared to the membership. I can also send you the slides if you are interested in reviewing them. I believe I saw something in the chat earlier as well about seeing the budget templates. And I'd be happy if you want to send me an email. I'd be happy to share with you how I format my budget, both my line item budget, but also my carryover narratives. And I also mentioned during the presentation how I submit my student travel experiences separate, above and beyond. So feel free to send me an email. You can email me at acinderi@kent.edu. I'm actually going to type that into the chat right now so everyone has it. And you can also email me at finance@eoa.org. Make sure I spelled that correctly. So that is now in there. Kenny, can you, if you're still here, can you please share with everybody how they'll receive or be able to access both the recording and the PowerPoint slides that I provide? Is it going to be posted somewhere? Is it going to be emailed to participants? How will they be able to access it?
I would just need you to send your PowerPoint, but I'll have the video. It normally takes an hour or so to process, so we'll probably send it out. If it doesn't come out through the general EOA email, it's going to come out through best practices. So it's either going to come out from me or best practices, one of the two. But either way, it's probably going to come through the EOA listserv.
Okay, and I did see one last comment, and I think it's important, so I want to make sure we add this in before everybody signs off. Someone mentioned that they attended the COE Legislation and Regulations virtual training for EOC and Veterans Upward Bound last Thursday and Friday with Maureen, Angelica, and Kimberly Jones from COE. They said that there would not be a carry forward ceiling this year, and to be creative on how you will spend your dollars. I too have heard that. I've not received anything concrete from the Department of Ed specifying that, but I did hear that as well. that there will not be a cap on carryover. I think in the TRIO world, we tend to hear, 30,000 or 35,000, somewhere around that ballpark is typically what they say is, where to be. But I too heard that there would not be a ceiling. However, I also have heard that that does not apply to SSS programs because that is a whole different ball game when it comes to carrying forward from one grant cycle to the next. So, but all other programs who are still within their 5 years and are not up for renewal, you should be okay based on what has been circulating and has been said a couple of times from COE. If you have any other additional questions, again, feel free to email me, but also feel free to reach out to EOA, our leadership, the board of directors, your regional leadership and or your chapter executive boards, and also feel free to reach out to COE. They're here as a resource and they're always more than willing to help answer any question that you might have. And if that's it, then I will say that we are wrapped up and everyone enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Good luck to those of you who have just kicked off your summer institutes or your summer research programs with McNair, or are busy planning for what your summer and your next academic year looks like. So take care, stay safe, and be well.